The moment I heard my daughter's voice on the phone, that careful, measured tone she'd been practicing, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. "Mom, we're concerned about you. We think you should see someone." The words came wrapped in false concern, each one a small knife. I was standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, holding my coffee mug, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the walls closer, like everything was contracting around me. My hands went cold, not from fear exactly, but from recognition. Recognition of a pattern I'd been too trusting to see coming. I'm Opalian Vega, 47 years old, and I've spent the last 3 decades being the person everyone relied on. I managed finances, organized holidays, remembered birthdays, held the family together through divorces and job losses, and my husband's slow decline into early onset dementia. I was the strong one, the capable one, the one who never needed anything because I was too busy making sure everyone else had what they needed. That was my identity. That was my value. And now, standing in my kitchen with my daughter's concerned voice still echoing through the phone, I realized that identity was about to be weaponized against me. The signs had been there for weeks, I realize now, but I'd dismissed them as normal family dynamics. My son Aaron had started calling more frequently, asking odd questions about my daily routines. "How are you feeling, Mom? Any memory issues? Any confusion?" My daughter Violina had been subtly suggesting I see my doctor, mentioning articles about early cognitive decline. My sister Yulene had made a point of visiting last month, watching me carefully as I made dinner, as if she was cataloging my movements for evidence of something. Even my husband Joan, whose own mind was becoming increasingly unreliable, had been coached to comment on things I'd supposedly done or said that I had no memory of, things that had never happened. I didn't put it together until I found the email. It was an accident, really. I was looking for a confirmation number for my car insurance when I opened Aaron's email account on the shared family iPad. He'd left himself logged in. I shouldn't have looked, but something in my gut had been screaming at me for days, a low-level alarm I couldn't quite identify. The email was from a lawyer, a psychiatrist, a financial advisor. The subject line read, "Competency Evaluation and Guardianship Strategy." My vision narrowed. The words blurred and then sharpened, each one landing like a physical blow. They'd been planning this. My children, my sister. They were constructing a narrative, a story about my declining mental state, about my wandering episodes and confusion, about my need for professional intervention. The psychiatrist's notes mentioned possible early-onset dementia and behavioral red flags consistent with cognitive decline. The lawyer had outlined the process for establishing guardianship. The financial advisor had calculated what they could access once I was deemed incompetent. My hands shook as I scrolled through months of correspondence. They'd been documenting everything. Conversations I'd had, decisions I'd made, normal everyday moments that they'd reframed as evidence of instability. That time, I forgot what I'd gone to the grocery store for, a sign of memory loss. That moment I'd been quiet at dinner, evidence of depression and withdrawal. That afternoon, I'd taken a walk alone and gotten turned around on an unfamiliar street, proof of my inability to navigate the world safely. They were building a case against me, and they were building it meticulously. I forced myself to think clearly, to breathe, to not let panic overtake the analytical part of my mind that had always been my greatest asset. I had maybe days, maybe hours before they made their move. The lawyer's email had mentioned an upcoming family intervention scheduled for the following week. That was their plan. To gather everyone together, to confront me with their fabricated concerns, to suggest I voluntarily see a psychiatrist for evaluation. And once I was in that system, once I'd been officially evaluated by a professional they'd likely coached or influenced, the rest would follow like dominoes. I couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what they were doing. If I told Joan, he'd forget by tomorrow and might accidentally reveal my knowledge to Aaron. If I told my friends, they'd worry and might inadvertently tip off my family. I was alone in this. Completely, utterly alone. The first thing I did was take screenshots of everything. I photographed the emails, the documents, the financial projections. I created a hidden folder on my personal laptop and stored everything there, encrypted it, backed it up to a cloud account my family didn't know about. My hands moved mechanically through these tasks, but my mind was racing, calculating, planning. I'd spent decades managing complex situations, managing my family's chaos, managing my husband's illness, managing the logistics of keeping a household functioning. Now I was applying those same skills to managing my own survival. Then I went to the bank. I needed to understand what they were planning to access. I pulled my account statements for the last 6 months and reviewed them carefully. My retirement fund, my savings, the small inheritance my mother had left me. They were looking at roughly $400,000. Not a fortune, but enough to be worth the effort of having me declared incompetent. Enough to motivate a plan like this. I didn't withdraw anything. That would be a red flag, would show that I knew something was happening. Instead, I went to a different bank, one where I had an old account I hadn't used in years, and I transferred money gradually. Small amounts that wouldn't trigger alerts or raise suspicion. 5,000 here, 8,000 there. I was buying myself time and options, creating a financial escape route in case I needed it. My hands were steady as I did this, but my insides felt like they were liquefying. This was my family. These were the people I'd sacrificed for. Aaron had been a difficult child, prone to anger and impulsivity, and I'd spent years in therapy learning how to manage his moods, how to not take his outbursts personally. Violina had struggled with anxiety and depression, and I'd been her rock, her safe place, the person she called at 3 a.m. when the panic got too intense. Yuleen had always been jealous of my independence, my ability to handle things, my refusal to be diminished by circumstance or limitation. And now they were using everything they knew about me. My competence, my reliability, my tendency to put everyone else's needs before my own, as evidence of something wrong with me. The week before the scheduled intervention, I did something I'd never done before. I hired a lawyer, not to fight them directly, but to protect myself. I met with Quinea Wheeler in a small office downtown, and I laid out everything I'd found. The emails, the documents, the plan. Quinea listened without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. She was a woman in her 50s, with the kind of calm competence that comes from having seen every variation of human cruelty. "They're trying to establish guardianship," Quinea said finally, leaning back in her chair. "To control your assets and your decisions. It's not uncommon, unfortunately, especially in families where there's a significant amount of money involved and where one person is perceived as vulnerable." "I'm not vulnerable," I said. The words came out sharp, defensive. "I know," Quinea replied, "but that's what makes this dangerous. You're competent, you're capable, and that makes it harder for them to convince a judge that you need a guardian. Which means they'll need to manufacture more evidence. They'll need to create situations where you appear confused or unstable. They might try to gaslight you into actually becoming unstable." The word hung in the air between us. Gaslight. I'd read about it. I understood it intellectually. But hearing it applied to my own situation made it suddenly real in a way it hadn't been before. What do I do? I asked. First, we document everything: your mental state, your competence. We get you evaluated by an independent psychiatrist before they can push their own evaluation. We establish a clear record that you're mentally sound. Second, we make sure your wishes are documented. We create a will that reflects your actual intentions, not theirs. We establish a healthcare proxy that's not one of your children. We take away their legal leverage. And if they still try? I asked. Then we fight them in court. But it's much harder to establish guardianship over someone who's already been evaluated by an independent professional and found to be competent. It's much harder when there's a documented record of your wishes. You're essentially building a fortress around yourself before they can lay siege. I nodded, but I was thinking about something else. Something Quineo hadn't said, but that I could read between the lines of her careful professionalism. Even if I won legally, I would lose my family. There was no scenario where I exposed this plot and maintained relationships with my children. The best I could hope for was that Joan wouldn't understand what was happening, wouldn't blame me for it. The best I could hope for was survival. The independent psychiatric evaluation took place 3 days before the scheduled family intervention. Dr. Ramuna Hunter was a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and an office that smelled like lavender and old books. She spent 2 hours with me, asking questions, having me take cognitive tests, observing my behavior. She asked about my childhood, my marriage, my work history. She asked about my mood, my sleep, my stress levels. She asked me to draw a clock, to remember a list of words, to do math problems. I performed perfectly. Not because I was trying to impress her, but because I was genuinely fine. My mind was sharp. My memory was intact. My reasoning was sound. The only thing that was fractured was my sense of safety, my trust in the people who were supposed to love me. When she was done, Dr. Hunter leaned back in her chair and looked at me directly. Your family mentioned concerns about memory loss and confusion. I don't see any evidence of that. Your cognitive function is excellent. Your mood is appropriate. You're articulate, organized, and your thinking is clear. I'm going to write a report documenting my findings. This report will be admissible in court if necessary. I felt something release in my chest, something I hadn't even realized I was holding. Thank you, I said. Is there something else you want to tell me? Dr. Hunter asked. Something about your family situation? I considered it, but I knew that if I told her about the plan, about the emails and the lawyer, and the scheme to have me declared incompetent, she would be obligated to report it. She would involve authorities. It would escalate everything. So I just shook my head. No, I said. I think I'm fine. The intervention happened on a Saturday afternoon. They'd arranged it carefully, I realized. A time when Joan would be at his day program so he wouldn't be confused by what was happening. My living room filled up with people I loved: Aaron and his wife Letta, Violina and her husband Stio. Uline, a family therapist they'd hired named Rosiella Soto, and my mother-in-law Lilara, who'd been part of the planning but whose presence was meant to add an air of neutrality and concern. We're here because we love you, Rosiella began, her voice carefully modulated, trained. And we're concerned about some changes we've noticed. I sat on my couch and listened as they outlined their case. The grocery store incident, the time I'd been quiet, the walk where I'd gotten turned around. They'd reframed every normal moment of my life as evidence of decline. They presented it all with such care, such false gentleness, that for a moment I could see how someone else might believe them, how a judge might believe them, how I might start to doubt myself. But I didn't, because I had documentation. I had Dr. Hunter's evaluation. I had screenshots of their emails. I had a lawyer. And most importantly, I had clarity about what was happening. I appreciate your concern, I said calmly, my voice steady. But I want to show you something. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos of the emails. I watched their faces change. Watched the careful concern drain away and be replaced by shock, then anger, then calculation. Aaron's jaw clenched. Violina's eyes went wide. Yulene's face flushed red. You've been planning this for months, I continued. You've been documenting my normal life as evidence of incompetence. You've been in contact with lawyers and financial advisors about accessing my assets. You've been coaching Dad to corroborate stories that never happened. Mom, that's not... Violina started, but I held up my hand. I've had an independent psychiatric evaluation. I'm mentally sound. My cognitive function is excellent. I've updated my will and my healthcare proxy. I've documented this plan you've made. And I have a lawyer who's ready to file for harassment and elder abuse if any of you try to move forward with this. The room was silent. The therapist, Rosiella, looked genuinely shocked. I wondered if she'd known the full extent of what my family was planning, or if she'd just been hired to provide professional legitimacy to their concerns. You're being ungrateful, Yuline said suddenly, her voice sharp. After everything we've tried to do for you, after we've sacrificed? I stood up. My legs felt strong. My mind felt clear. I've spent my entire life sacrificing for this family. I managed your finances when you were drowning in debt, Yuline. I paid for your therapy, Violina. I helped raise your children when you were too unstable to do it yourself. I've given everything, and this is how you repay me? By trying to have me declared incompetent so you can control what's left? Aaron's face was dark. You're the one being ungrateful. We've tried to help you. We've tried to get you professional help. You've tried to construct a case against me, I said. There's a difference. And I'm done. I want you all out of my house. Mom! Violina's voice was pleading, but I couldn't afford to soften. Softening would be weakness. Softening would give them an opening. Out, I repeated. All of you. They left, but not before the room filled with accusations and anger and desperate attempts to convince me I was the unreasonable one. Lilara tried to mediate. Rosiella looked uncomfortable, but they all eventually filed out of my living room, and I was alone again. My hands were shaking when they left, but it was a different kind of shaking than before. This was adrenaline. This was the aftermath of confrontation, not the prelude to disaster. The weeks that followed were strange and disorienting. I expected legal action. I expected them to try a different approach, but instead, there was silence. Aaron didn't call. Violina sent a text message asking if we could talk, but when I didn't respond, she didn't push. Yuline stopped coming by. It was as if, by revealing that I knew their plan, I'd somehow removed their ability to execute it. But the silence was its own kind of damage. Because now, every time my phone rang, I tensed. Every time I forgot something small, where I'd put my keys, what I'd gone into a room to get, I felt a spike of panic. They'd planted a seed of doubt in me. Even though I knew I was fine, even though I had professional documentation of my mental competence, part of me started questioning myself. That was their real victory, I realized. Not in getting me declared incompetent, but in making me doubt myself, in making me second-guess my own mind, in poisoning the well of my own self-trust. I started keeping a journal, not a diary, but a detailed record of my days. What I did, what I accomplished, moments of clarity and competence. I was building a case for myself, a documentation of my own sanity. It was exhausting and paranoid and probably unnecessary, but it helped. I also started making plans. Real plans. Plans for what I would do with the rest of my life now that I knew I couldn't count on my family. I'd spent so much of my identity on being needed by them, on being the strong one they could rely on. Now I had to figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by their needs. I started volunteering at a community center, working with older adults who were navigating cognitive decline and memory loss. Real cognitive decline, not the fabricated kind my family had invented. I found purpose in helping people who were actually struggling, in being useful in a way that didn't depend on my family's validation. I also started spending more time with Joan. His decline was accelerating, and the irony wasn't lost on me. My family had been trying to have me declared incompetent while my husband was actually losing his mind. I became his primary caregiver, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because I loved him, even though he sometimes didn't recognize me. Even though his good days were becoming rarer. 3 months after the intervention, Aaron called. His voice was different, softer, uncertain. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no. But something in me wanted to understand, wanted to know if there was any possibility of reconciliation, any way forward that didn't end with me completely severed from my family. We met at a cafe near my house. Aaron looked older than I remembered, more worn down. He ordered coffee and didn't say anything for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for what we tried to do, for the plan, for all of it." I waited. This felt like a trap, or at least like the beginning of a manipulation. "Violina's been in therapy," he continued, talking about why we thought that was okay, about our own issues with control and fear, about how we were trying to manage our anxiety about your aging by trying to control you. "That's very therapeutic," I said, and I meant it, but there was an edge to my voice. "It doesn't excuse it," Aaron said. "I know that, but I wanted you to know that we've recognized what we did was wrong. And I wanted to ask if there's any way we can fix this, if there's any way we can have a relationship again." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, this person who'd tried to have me declared incompetent, and I felt something shift in me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of acceptance. Acceptance that he was flawed, that he'd done something terrible, and that I could acknowledge both things at the same time. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can trust you again, but I'm willing to try. If you're willing to actually do the work, if you're willing to respect my autonomy and my right to make my own decisions, even if you disagree with them." "I am," Aaron said. "I will be." It wasn't a complete reconciliation. It wasn't a return to the way things had been. But it was a beginning, a possibility, a small opening in what had felt like a completely closed door. Violina and I had a similar conversation a few weeks later. She was more emotional than Aaron, more openly remorseful. She talked about her own mental health struggles and how she'd projected her fears onto me. She talked about how she'd convinced herself that she was helping, that she was protecting me, when really she was just trying to control the one person in her life who'd always been strong enough to handle things. "I needed you to need me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And when you didn't, I panicked. I thought if you were incompetent, if you needed help, then I could finally be useful. I could finally be the strong one." I listened to her confession and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at her for what she'd tried to do. compassion for the brokenness that had led her to try it, sadness that we'd both been operating from such wounded places. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it, mostly. But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to how things were. It means we move forward differently. Uline never apologized. She doubled down, insisting that she'd been trying to help, that I was being ungrateful and dramatic. She spread stories about my mental state among family friends, trying to salvage the narrative she and my children had started to construct. But eventually, people stopped listening. They stopped believing her. And she faded from my life, not with a bang, but with a slow, steady withdrawal. A year after the intervention, Joan had a stroke, a significant one that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. I became his full-time caregiver, and it was harder than anything I'd done before. Harder than managing my family's chaos. Harder than building a case for my own sanity. Harder than surviving the betrayal of the people I loved most. But it was also simpler, because there was no ambiguity. There was no question about whether I was doing the right thing. I was taking care of my husband. I was being present for him. I was loving him through his decline, and that was enough. Aaron and Violina helped. They came by to sit with him while I ran errands. They brought meals. They were present in a way that felt genuine, not performative. It was a slow rebuilding of trust, a gradual repair of the damage they'd done. I never fully trusted them the way I had before. That part of me, the part that had believed they would always have my best interests at heart, had been permanently altered. But I learned to trust them in smaller, more bounded ways, to let them help without surrendering my autonomy, to accept their presence without depending on their validation. 2 years after the intervention, I made a decision. I was going to move. Not far, just to a different house in the same town. A smaller place, easier to manage, with a main floor bedroom and bathroom so that Joan wouldn't have to navigate stairs. A fresh start, in a way. A space that was mine, that didn't carry the weight of all the family history and all the betrayal. The process of moving was its own kind of therapy. Going through my things, deciding what mattered, what I wanted to carry forward into this new phase of my life. I found old journals, old photographs, evidence of all the years I'd spent being the strong one, the capable one, the one everyone depended on. I looked at pictures of myself from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and I barely recognized that woman. She looked so certain, so sure of her place in the world. But I was different now. I'd been broken, and I'd put myself back together. I'd been betrayed, and I'd learned to trust again, carefully, with boundaries. I'd been tested, and I'd survived. That woman from the photographs would have been ashamed of me for not being able to keep my family together, for not being strong enough to hold everything in place. But I was learning that strength wasn't about holding everything together. Strength was about knowing when to let go. The day I moved into the new house, Aaron and Violina came to help. They carried boxes and assembled furniture and made sure everything was in place. Joan sat in a chair in the living room, watching the activity with the confused but peaceful expression that had become his default since the stroke. "This is nice," Violina said, looking around the bright open space. "It feels like you." "It does," I agreed, and it was true. For the first time in years, I was creating a space that was entirely mine, not designed to accommodate everyone else's needs, not structured around being the person everyone could lean on. Just mine. That evening, after Aaron and Violina had left, I sat on my new porch and watched the sunset. Joan was asleep inside, his breathing steady and peaceful. The house was quiet around me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but peace. A sense that I'd survived something difficult and come out the other side intact. I thought about the plan they'd made, the emails and the lawyers and the psychiatrist they'd tried to use against me. I thought about the moment I'd realized what they were doing, the terror and betrayal I'd felt. I thought about how close they'd come to succeeding, to actually having me declared incompetent, to taking control of my life and my assets and my autonomy. And I realized that I'd never be able to completely forgive them for that. Some betrayals are too fundamental. Some violations of trust run too deep. But I could move forward. I could rebuild relationships that acknowledged what had happened without being destroyed by it. I could be in their lives without depending on them. I could love them while also protecting myself from them. That was the real victory, I understood. Not in exposing their plan or in winning some legal battle. The victory was in surviving intact, in maintaining my sense of self despite their attempt to redefine me as incompetent, in refusing to let their narrative become my reality. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned that deep purple that happens in those few moments between day and night. I sat on my porch and breathed in the cool evening air, and I felt grateful. Not for what had happened. I would never be grateful for that. But grateful that I'd survived it. Grateful that I was still here, still myself, still capable of loving and building and moving forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Joan's decline would continue. My relationship with my family would require ongoing work and maintenance. There would be moments when I questioned my decisions, when I wondered if I'd handled things differently. But tonight, I was at peace. I'd been tested by the people closest to me, and I'd passed the test. Not by being perfect, or by never doubting myself, or by maintaining perfect relationships with everyone. I'd passed by knowing who I was and refusing to let anyone else's narrative override my own truth. I'd passed by building a fortress around my autonomy and defending it fiercely. I'd passed by surviving. And that was enough. If you or someone you know is experiencing family manipulation or concerns about guardianship, reach out to an elder law attorney or local protective services. You don't have to face it alone.